Crucial moments in this game, but I just want to highlight one that Robert actually mentioned, but Gukesh simply didn't have enough time to calculate, and it was this critical moment. White is trying to play King of the Hill, my favourite variant, by the way, trying to get the king into the centre of the board, but this did allow Black one moment to save the game. Knight takes pawn. Getting rid of those strong white pawns would potentially have turned things around somewhat. What Black does get 2 pawns for the knight. This is a check, and maybe a third pawn would drop off on the edge of the board later. Suddenly, you've got rid of the strongest part of White's position and great chances to save the game. Instead, he let the pawn survive. He simply moved his rook to the wrong side of the board. And if we fast forward to the end now, we saw the final stages of this game. The white rook centralised, and once the pawn started stepping forward in the centre, there was no way to save the game. Rook d8, eliminating the blockader, and White was about to make a new queen. And today's learning point is about how to play for a win at all costs. Gukesh, in the opening, surprised his opponent, Erigaisi, with some really creative and some really clever play. In this position, he shocked us all here, all of the commentators, by playing h4. What is this doing, you might ask? He's simply going to push his pawn forward and make it less attractive for the black king to castle on the king side. His next move, another shock, king to f1, putting the king on a slightly odd square, but committing to lifting his rook up the board, where, as we saw in the game, it did prove to be a very strong piece. It was a crazy game, of course, many twists and turns. Later, Gukesh sacrificed his queen, but Erigaisi, at the right moment, was able to lock things down by giving his own queen back. I definitely recommend playing through all of this game. It's well worth a study. Yeah, it looks like Magnus, because of the clock, was reluctant to start a race, which would have been in his favour. Instead, he waited for one move too long. He tried to finesse it, and the moment passed, and the win slipped away. It started in this position. We said the black king was getting active. It was getting ready to jump towards those white pawns. If, for example, we start by capturing a pawn on the side of the board, the black king could start advancing. But Magnus, if he'd had 2 minutes on his clock, he would have had the time to work out that he is winning. He can move his king out of the way. Yes, the black king can come in, but it's simply too slow. The white pawn can step forward now. The king can take this pawn. But at the right moment, you will go and kick this knight away with the white king, and you'll have a safe run through to promotion. Magnus missed this opportunity. If we go back and, whoops, not to this position, we did eventually see king and knight versus king. It was a draw. Just for one move, it was very temporary, but Magnus did miss the moment. He replied instantly, and he did regret it, as we saw on the camera a moment ago. It was here that Hikaru played a bit of a careless move. He brought his bishop in. This is tempting. It's very understandable, very human. You want to block the d-file. This bishop is very annoying to get rid of for black, but Magnus missed that just this one moment he could slide his queen back, hitting this white rook in the corner, and suddenly nowhere good to run for this white rook. If you run across the board, preventing a move we'll show in a moment, then suddenly you just drop a pawn. The black rook will happily take this pawn, material advantage and a winning position. Instead, if you defend this pawn, if you keep it defended, then bishop to c3 does pose a big problem for this white rook. Suddenly this white rook is tied down. It doesn't have too many squares to go to, and this bishop will be lost. For example, if it tries to come up the board, then you can overwhelm this bishop due to a pin on the d-file. Guaranteed to win material, at least a rook for bishop, and Magnus would have guided this to victory. It was really instructive how Hikaru just hoovered off all the pieces and kept a measure of control throughout. We mentioned in this position he had a choice. He could have captured this white knight and maybe imbalanced it slightly, kept the game alive, kept the queens, kept the rooks on the board, but he said no. He'd calculated very accurately that these doubled b pawns were well compensated for by his dynamism, his piece activity. We saw the rooks leave the board. Magnus's knight had to step out of the attack, and this queen move. Every move from here till the end was very accurate from both sides. We saw an offer of a queen trade. Hikaru said, no, not for you. I'm conquering this open file. And after a few moves, again, this really precise move order that Tanya mentioned, dropping the knight into e4, far more accurate than any queen trade, than any rook trade. And the logical end to the game was this one, a little dance between the bishop and queen. The queen has nowhere to go other than to take this pawn if it wants to defend b4. And that status quo continues for the remaining moves. A repetition to end the game, but a fair draw. Magnus did play a really exemplary game, we should mention. Hikaru tried everything. He tried to throw Magnus off balance. He tried to hustle on the clock, but to no avail. And it was actually here that Magnus had a winning shot. He didn't spot it. It was difficult, we should mention. It was knight takes pawn, just to open up a check against the white king. This check would have been deadly if the knight had been recaptured. A check, the king moves in. Maybe the one that Magnus hadn't spotted is that you first have to push this pawn forward to break the white bishop's connection with this h6 square. Next, the rook slides across to win. And if we fast forward to the endgame, Magnus here was in full control. He had these two running pawns. He should have been winning for black, but he found a really nice way to guide it to safety, and Hikaru never got a chance to win on the board.